Hello, my friend. Welcome to the long quiet. Tonight you are a Vermont sugarmaker tending an evaporator through a long March night in your sugar shack. In 1934, by a little after 7 o'clock on a late March evening in the year 1934, on a small back hillside in the Green Mountain foothills of central Vermont, where the snow still lay heavy along the upper sugarbush, and the maples stood bare against the deepening blue of the sky, a man named Albert Larkin closed the kitchen door of his farmhouse behind him and stepped out into the cold. His name was Albert. He was 56 years old. He was the third Larkin to make syrup on this hillside, after his father, Caleb, who had made it from 1885 until his death in 1921, and his grandfather, Augustus, who had bought the land and tapped the first trees in 1868. Albert had been making syrup himself, alongside one or the other of them, and then alone, for 41 consecutive springs. He stood for a moment on the small back porch and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The supper Edith had made him sat warm and easy in his belly. Edith had brought him the thermos already filled, in the way she had been bringing it for 31 years of married Larkin sugaring, and she had set it in his hand at the door, and she had reached up and pulled the flap of his cap down on the left side, which always rode up, and she had said only, "Come back to me by morning." And he had said, "I will." That was all. The path from the kitchen door down to the sugar shack ran perhaps a quarter-mile through the lower edge of the sugar bush, in a slow, easy curve along the contour of the hillside, dropping a little where it crossed the small stone-walled meadow, and then rising again into the trees. Albert had walked it for 41 springs. He could have walked it in the deep dark with his eyes closed. He walked it now in the early dark of the late March evening, which was not really evening anymore so much as the long thinning hour just after sundown, when the sky still held a little of its blue, and the snow on the ground gave back a faint pale glow of its own. He lit the lantern. The lantern was a small brass kerosene lantern with a tall glass chimney and a wire bale. It had been his father's lantern, and his grandfather's before that, as the brass of it had been worn smooth by 60-some years of hands. and a small dent had been put in its base in 1897 when Augustus had set it down too hard on a frozen stump. The dent had become familiar. Many things had become familiar. The lantern took at the first match and stood up small and clean and yellow in the cold of the porch. He pulled the chimney down over the flame. He stepped down off the porch. The snow crunched under his boots in the small, dry way that late March snow crunches at evening, when the day has had a little melt in it, and the night has begun to take that melt back into ice. Each step was a small, precise sound. He went past the smokehouse. He went past the small shed that held the cordwood for the parlor stove. He came to the gate of the lower pasture. The gate was a wooden gate with an iron latch, and the latch was cold even through his glove. He worked it open and stepped through and pulled it shut behind him in the small, careful way a man closes a gate at night. The hinge gave its small, particular creak. The latch fell. He walked on. The path went into the trees. The trees were maples. They were the upper edge of the sugarbush proper. The same trees his grandfather had tapped 66 years before, and many of them had been tapped every spring since. And many of them stood now with the small dark dots of healed-over tap holes running up their trunks in slow spiral patterns. Most were sugar maples, the kind the Vermonters had been working since before there were Vermonters, with the high straight trunks and the bark gone gray furrowed with age. A few were red maple, lower along the path, where the ground turned wetter in spring. A few yellow birches stood among them, wide at the high branches. Albert walked among them. He held the lantern at his hip, and the lantern made a small yellow circle around him, perhaps 3 feet across. And beyond that circle, the world was the slow blue-gray of late evening on snow under bare trees. He could see the trees standing in the half-dark. He could see far off through the small gap where the path crossed the meadow a faint, pale glow that was the western sky still keeping a little of its sundown. He walked. The snow on the path was old snow now. Mid-March snow, which had been falling and refreezing on itself since November. The path was worn down through the snow by the regular passage of his own boots over the last 2 weeks of sugaring. and it ran like a faint pale trough through the wider field of untouched snow. And a man could not have lost it if he had tried. He did not try. He thought as he walked of nothing in particular. He thought perhaps of the gathering of sap he had done that afternoon with the team and the gathering tank, working from tree to tree along the south slope, the metal buckets full and the sap clear, and the day mild enough that he had unbuttoned his coat for a part of it. The tank was full now, and from the tank the sap ran by the small wooden trough into the head pan of the evaporator, and the boil had been going since 5 o'clock. The boil would still be going. He could see even from this distance the pale plume of steam rising from the cupola of the shack, far ahead through the tree. The cupola was the small vented roof structure that let the steam of the boil escape upward. Built by his father in 1905, when the present sugar shack had been put up. From its long horizontal vents, the steam went up in a slow, continuous column into the cold air of the evening. And when the air was still as it was tonight, the column rose straight. The column was a pale shape against the deeper blue of the sky. It rose slow and straight and disappeared at perhaps 30 feet up, where the cold air took it and dispersed it. There was no wind. The night was very still. The boil at the shack was going on without him, the firebox eating its wood and the pans giving up their water to the air. He smelled it before he could see it well. This was the smell of a sugarbush in boil, and there is no smell in the world quite like it. Albert had been smelling it for 41 springs, and had never grown tired of it. It was a sweet smell, but it was a thin sweetness, not the heavy sweetness of finished syrup. More the high vegetable sweetness of sap on the air, mixed with the small, clean tannin of the wood smoke from the firebox, mixed with a faint mineral note of the steam itself. The two together were the smell of sugaring, and there was nothing else in the world that smelled like it. He breathed it in. He kept walking. The path bent right where it met the small stone wall of the meadow, and Albert followed the bend. The stone wall had been laid by his grandfather in 1874, in the slow, careful way of a young man who meant the wall to stand. The wall did stand. Albert had patched 2 leaning places himself one June afternoon 5 years ago, in the way Augustus had taught him to patch a wall. He had only kept it the wall it already was. He came out of the small gap in the wall, and the path opened up into the upper meadow. The upper meadow was perhaps an acre, set into the hillside between the lower stand of maples and the higher stand where the sugar shack sat. In late March, it was a long, pale slope of snow, with the small, dark stubs of last year's hay cuttings showing through where the snow had melted out around them. Albert crossed. The sky above the meadow was a wide, quiet, open sky, and the first stars were coming out. He looked up. He could see Venus, low in the west. A small, bright, unhurried light over the dark trees. Polaris was up to the north, where it always was, and he could find it by the cup of the dipper, which his grandfather had taught him to find when he had been a boy of 6. On a clear November evening in 1884. The dipper was just rising now in the northeast. He saw it. He walked on. He came up out of the meadow and into the upper stand of maples, and the path began its last gentle climb to the small flat place where the sugar shack stood. The shack came into view through the trees as a small, dark, square shape with the long, pale rising of steam above it, and the small, low orange glow of the firebox door at its near end, visible even at this distance as a small, warm light low to the ground in the dark. Albert smiled, small, in the dim. The shack was working. The shack was always working in late March. The shack had worked for 30 years now, since his father had built it. The shack worked because a man tended it. He was the man tonight. He had been the man for many nights. He came up to the small flat clearing in front of the shack. The sugar shack was a small wooden building, perhaps 16 feet by 24, sided in unpainted plank that had gone silver gray with weather, with a slope roof and the small cupola rising from its center. There was a single small window on the east wall, and a single low door on the south wall. The chimney that vented the firebox came out of the west end of the building, and a small wash of pale smoke rose from it, drifting up to join the slower column from the cupola. The wood was stacked along the south side of the shack. It was good hard maple cordwood, and a quantity of dry pine for kindling, split and stacked by Albert and Bertram in October. The stack was head-high in places. The long courses laid bark up against the rain. Albert stopped briefly in front of the shack. He looked at it the way a man looks at a place he has come to many times, and will come to many times more, not really looking at it, only confirming that it was there, and that it was what it was. The shack was there. The steam was rising from the cupola in a slow, patient column. The firebox door at the near end was glowing its small, warm orange. Inside, the pans were boiling. He walked up to the door. He set the lantern down on the small, flat stone that lived beside the door for that purpose. He did not blow it out. He turned the wick down to a small kept light. He worked the latch with his cold fingers, and the door opened on its long iron hinge with a soft swing he knew well. The interior of the sugar shack came out to meet him. The first thing was the heat. The shack was warm inside, properly warm, in the particular damp warm of a working boil, where the air was full of fine warm steam from the pans, and the firebox at the far end was throwing its hard, dry, radiant heat across the room, and the two together made a kind of dense, pleasant warmth that pressed gently on a man's face when he stepped in from the cold. The second thing was the smell. The smell inside the shack was the same smell of the boil that Albert had smelled coming up through the trees. But here it was much stronger. The way any smell is more particular at its source. The high, sweet vegetable smell of sap. The small, clean tannin of wood smoke. The faint, warm, mineral note of steam. After 41 springs, it was the smell of work and home, and the small, good labor of a sugaring night. The third thing was the sound. The sound was the boil itself. The long, steady, gentle roar of a wood-fired evaporator going at full work, which was not really a roar exactly, but more a sustained quiet, seething. The small, continuous bubbling of sap at temperature across the long surface of the pans, mixed with the slower draft hum of the firebox at the far end, mixed with the small intermittent ticks and pops of the iron of the stove as it took the heat. The boil had a particular sound. It was a sound that lived in a sugar shack and nowhere else in the world. Albert closed the door behind him. He stood for a moment just inside and let the warmth and the smell and the sound come into him. He took off the heavier wool coat. He hung it on the iron hook beside the door, where his father and his grandfather had hung their coats. He took off the cap with the long ear flaps and hung it on the second hook. He worked the gloves off and laid them across the small bench by the door. He went to the evaporator. The evaporator was the long iron and tin assembly that ran almost the full length of the shack along the east wall. From the firebox at the west end to the head pan at the east end where the fresh sap came in. It had been bought by his father from the Leader Evaporator Company in St. Albans, and it had been replaced once in 1924 with the present unit. The pans were arranged in a series. The fresh sap came in at the head and worked its way down the long flue pan, gathering sugar as the water boiled off, and then dropped into the syrup pan at the front near the firebox, where the final boil happened and where the syrup, when it was finished, was drawn off. Albert went first to the head pan. He looked at the level. The float was riding at the right height. The sap from the storage tank above was running down through the small wooden trough at the proper rate, the trough giving its small, steady trickle, the head pan keeping its full, proper depth. He approved. He moved to the flue pan. The flue pan was the long, shallow pan with the deep, vertical flutes underneath, in which most of the water was boiled out of the sap. The boil here was vigorous, the surface in a state of constant small turbulence, with the fine, pale steam rising thick above it and curling up toward the dark of the cupola. The color of the sap had gone from clear to a faint pale yellow, the first hint of the long progression toward syrup. It was a good boil. He had set it before supper and it was holding. He moved to the syrup pan at the front. The syrup pan was smaller, and the sap in it had gone darker now, almost amber. And the boil here was a little quieter, more deliberate. The way a syrup boil quiets as the sugar concentration rises. He dipped the small dipper into the pan and let the liquid run off the dipper in a slow, heavy stream. He watched the stream. He had been watching syrup come off a dipper for 41 springs, and he could read the runoff the way some men read a newspaper. The liquid was perhaps 3/4 of the way to syrup. Maybe 4 hours yet. Maybe a little more, depending on the boil. He set the dipper back on its hook. He went to the firebox. The firebox was a long iron chamber at the west end of the evaporator, with a heavy door that opened toward the floor of the shack. Albert opened it. The heat from inside came out in a hard, dry wave, and he stepped back to let it go past him. Inside the firebox, the fire was going at a good, steady working pace. The maple cordwood throwing the long, flat, blue-red flames out under the pans. The bed of coals deep and orange. He took up the iron poker from its bracket. He shifted one or two of the burning logs to one side. He took 2 fresh splits of maple from the wood stack just inside the door and laid them on the bed, not crowding the fire, leaving room for the draft. The new wood sat for a moment and then began to take, the bark crackling first, then the small dry hiss of the wood beginning to give up its heat. He closed the firebox door, leaving the small 1/4-inch gap that gave the draft its full pull. He stood up. His knees did the small, low, quiet sound that 56-year-old knees made these days. He smiled faintly. He had been making syrup with that small sound in his knees for the last 6 or 7 springs. They had earned it. He went to the small wooden chair that stood beside the firebox. The chair was an old plain wooden chair with a woven rush seat that had been in the shack since his father's time and had been reseated twice that Albert could remember. Once by Augustus in his last working year, and once by Albert himself 5 winters back. The chair stood in the small particular place beside the firebox, where a man could sit and feel the heat of the fire on one side and the heat of the pans on the other, and have the dipper at hand. Albert sat down in it. He sat down slow, the way he did everything now, and he let himself settle into the chair, and he let the warmth of the shack come into him. He had not realized in the walk up from the house how much of the cold he had been carrying. The cold of a March evening in Vermont goes into a man slow. It does not announce itself the way January cold does, all sharp at the cheeks. It only settled, polite, into the bones. and you do not feel it until you come into a warm place, and the warm place finds it and pushes it out. The warm place was finding it now. He felt it leaving him in the way warmth always finds the cold, going first into his hand, then up his forearm, then across his chest, and at last into his belly. He flexed his hand. The fingers worked easy. He took the thermos from the bench by the door and came back to the chair. He sat back down. He unscrewed the small tin cup that was the cap of the thermos. He set the cap on the small wooden shelf nailed to the wall beside the chair, which his father had nailed there in 1906, and which had held thermos caps for almost 30 years. He poured a small, careful measure of coffee into the cap. He drank. The coffee was warm. Edith had filled the thermos at 6 o'clock when supper had been in the oven, and it had ridden in his coat pocket on the walk up, and it was still warm at perhaps 7:15, which was the way Edith had been filling thermoses for 31 years of married Larkin sugaring. He thanked her. In his mind, in the small, private way he thanked her. And he drank, small and careful, and the warmth went down into his chest with the small, steady spread of hot coffee on a cold March night. He set the cap down. He sat for some time without doing anything. He sat in the chair with his hands resting open on his lap, and his feet a polite distance from the firebox door, and his back against the wood of the chair back. And he let himself be in the shack. The boil went on. The fire went on. The steam went up through the cupola. The night around the shack went on being the night. He looked around the shack at the long, familiar arrangement of it. The evaporator ran along the east wall with the firebox at the west end. The wood was stacked just inside the south wall by the door. The small bench, the hooks for coats, the iron hook above the firebox where the dipper hung, a small open cabinet of plain shelves along the north wall, which held a tin of coffee, a small jar of sugar, a kerosene tin for the lantern, a coil of soft cotton string for tying off the tap spouts, a small wooden box of matches. On the top shelf, an old battered copy of the old farmer's Almanac for the year. On a small peg above the cabinet, a length of soft leather that was the strap from a long broken set of harness, kept there for no real reason, except that Augustus had hung it there sometime in the 1890s, and Albert had never taken it down. The lamp in the shack was not lit. The firebox door was throwing enough orange light into the shack now, and the steam off the pans was catching the orange light and giving it back as a soft general glow. He preferred the firelight to the lamp. The firelight was the working light of a sugar shack. The lamp was for reading. He sat outside in the still cold air of the late March evening. He could hear, very faint, the small, far-off sound of a sugar bush at night. A small, soft drip-drip from the eaves, where the steam had been condensing on the roofline. The small, dry crack of a branch settling under its load of snow. The slow, low groan, very faint, of a maple 100 yards off that had taken the cold into its wood and was contracting with the small private sound of cold wood. The sugar bush at night was a quiet place. Albert had been listening to its quiet for 41 springs. He drank from the cap of the thermos. The cap held perhaps 3 swallows of coffee, and he took them slow, the way a man takes coffee on a long night when he has time. The cap warm in his hand, and the coffee warm down his throat, and the warm of the shack all around him. The boil went on. The steady, gentle roar of the pans was the constant sound in the shack, and a man sitting in the chair after a few minutes ceased to notice it, the way a man ceases to notice the small, constant sounds of his own house. The clock in the hall, the small settling of the boards. The boil was a sound that simply was, in the way the wind in the maples outside simply was. It became part of the architecture of the room. He thought in the slow, soft way thoughts come on the first quiet hour of a long, sugaring night, of his grandfather. He thought of Augustus. Augustus Larkin had been a small man, never tall, never heavy, with a long brown beard that had gone gray in his later years and white at the end. He had come up out of southern New Hampshire as a young man in 1863, and he had bought this hillside cheap from a man named Pettingill who had lost his sons in the war and could not work it alone. Augustus had been 26 years old. He had been a man of small hands and quiet ways, and a careful, patient temper. He had not been a sugar maker before he had come to this hillside. He had learned it from the neighbor, from a man named Whitmore who had had a sugar bush over the next ridge. And Augustus had walked over through the early springs of 70 and 71 and 72 and watched and asked questions and gone back to his own tree and tapped them in his own way until he had a way of his own. The first sugaring on this hillside in the spring of 1869 had been done with 8 iron kettles set over a long open trench fire under a canvas roof, and the sap had been hauled by hand in oak buckets from the buckets on the trees. Augustus had made 40 gallons of syrup that year. He had told Albert this once, in 1892, when Albert had been 14 years old, and Augustus had been 50, on a March night much like this one. Augustus had said, 40 gallons that first year, and I thought I had done a fine thing. I had done a fine thing. But there is no end to learning how to make syrup. You learn it the rest of your life, and you are not done. He had taken Albert into the sugar bush the next morning and shown him how to set a tap. He had drilled the small hole into the bark at the proper angle. He had set the spout. He had hung the bucket. He had done this in the slow, precise way he did everything. And Albert had watched. And then Albert had done one himself. And Augustus had watched. And Augustus had said only, "That is well done," and had walked on to the next tree. Augustus had not been a man of many words. The words he said were always exactly enough. Augustus had died in 1904 at the age of 62 of pneumonia after the spring sugaring in the small back bedroom of the farmhouse where Albert and Edith now slept. Albert had been 26 years old. He had sat with Augustus the last 2 nights, and Augustus, in his last clear hour, had only said, "It has been a good life, Albert," in his small, quiet voice, and had closed his eyes and had not spoken again. Albert had stood at the window of the small back bedroom and watched the sun come up over the ridge to the east. And he had thought in the small inward way he thought such things, that a man who had built a sugar bush from nothing and made syrup on this hillside for 36 springs had had, by any reasonable measure, a good life. Albert had been making the syrup ever since, alongside his father Caleb for 17 more springs, and alone since 1921. He thought of all this now, in the slow, soft way of a man at the chair beside the firebox, looking at the long boil of the syrup pan, with the orange light of the fire on the planks of the floor, and the steady, gentle roar of the evaporator, the only sound in the world. He thought, with no particular weight to the thought, that there were 3 Larkins now who had stood in this shack and looked at this same long boil. Augustus first, then Caleb, then him. The trees had stood before the Larkins had come to this hillside, and they would stand after the Larkins were gone. And the work the Larkins had done in their 66 springs had been good work, and the work would have been worth doing whether or not it went on. He sat with this thought for a long, quiet moment. He let it be the thought it was. He let it pass. He stood up, slow, and went to the firebox. The fire had taken the new wood well, and it was throwing a hard, steady working heat. He looked at the bed. He saw by the depth of the coals that he would not need to feed it again for perhaps another 40 minutes. He took up the long-handled iron skimmer from the bench beside the evaporator, and he skimmed the surface of the syrup pan once, slow, drawing off the small ring of foam that had built at the edge. And he set the skimmer back. The skimmer had been his father's. The handle was worn smooth where his father's hand had gripped it for years. Albert's own grip had not quite worn the same place. He used the skimmer his own way. He went back to the chair. He sat. The Almanac was on the top shelf of the cabinet, in the small worn paperboard cover of its issue for 1934, which Edith had brought home from the general store in town in January. Albert reached up and took it down. He set it on his lap. He opened it. The almanac was the same almanac it had been every year of Albert's life. The small, thick-paged, paper-bound book with the long columns of weather predictions, and the small, short articles on farm matters, and the calendar of feast days and moon phases. Albert had been reading it for 40-some years. He did not read it for the predictions, particularly. He read it for the small, comfortable feeling of it. It was a book a man in a sugar shack could read for 10 minutes and sit down and come back to in another 10 and find his place still in roughly the same place. It was more like a quiet companion than a book to be read. He turned to the section for late March. He read. In the small, steady firelight from the firebox door, the small, short paragraph on signs to expect. Melt by day, freeze by night. The slow opening of the south slopes, the early movement of the sap. He read the small notice that the full moon would fall on the 29th this year. He read the small rye sentence at the end of the paragraph. A wise farmer takes no liberty with March. He smiled, faint in the firelight. He turned a page. He read a small column on the proper care of dairy cattle in the late winter months. He turned another page. He read a small recipe for boiled sugar candy. He read a small short piece on the New England planting calendar. He set the almanac down on his lap. He sat for a moment. He drank. Slow from the thermos, having refilled the cap. The boil went on. The fire in the firebox had settled into the long, steady work of a fire that had its draft and its fuel sorted out. And it made the small, sustained low sound any working fire makes inside an iron chamber. Almost a breath. Once in a while, a knot in one of the maple splits would let go with a small, short pop, and a brief shower of sparks would hit the inside of the small mica window in the door and die. The pans hummed in their long, quiet seethe. The steam went up. He sat for a long while. He stood after a time slowly and put another 2 splits into the firebox. He stood at the syrup pan and dipped the dipper and watched the runoff. The liquid had darkened a small degree. He estimated perhaps 3 hours yet. Perhaps 3.5, depending on the boil. He approved the boil. He skimmed the foam once. He sat back down. He read another 2 pages of the Almanac. He set the book on the shelf beside him. He sat without reading. He drank from the thermos again. The small, careful sips. By perhaps 9:30, the shack had settled into its full night rhythm. The boil was steady. The fire was working. The steam went up. Albert had fed the firebox 3 times now by the small interior clock of his attention. and had skimmed the pans 4 times and had checked the runoff twice more, and the syrup by the run was now perhaps 5/6 of the way to finish. He let himself settle deeper into the chair. The shack had a particular quality at night in the middle hours of a boil. The boil itself made a kind of sustained quiet that was not silence exactly, but a presence of sound that the mind, after some hours of it, took as the ground state of the world. A man in a sugar shack at midnight ceased to notice that he was inside a constant, low, sustained roar. He noticed only the small notes against it, the small pop of a knot, the small drip from a roof beam. He noticed now an owl. The owl had called from somewhere up the ridge. A single long, low double note. The call of a great horned owl. Albert had heard the same owl, or another like it, almost every night of every sugaring season for many years. The owl worked the ridge through the spring. It hunted the small voles that came up out of the snowpack on the warmer days. It called once an hour or so in the small private declaration. Owls made to whatever creature, owl or man, was listening. Albert listened. He liked the owl. He liked the owl in the way a man on a long, quiet night liked any small thing that confirmed the world was going on beyond the walls of his small lit place. The owl was out there. The owl had its own work. The owl and Albert were both working the night, in their different ways, and the night was room enough for both of them. The owl called once more. Then it was quiet for a long time. Albert thought idly in the way he had been thinking in small drifts all night, about the long line of men and women who had worked sugaring nights on this hillside. His grandfather, his father, himself, Edith, in the early years, who had come up to the shack on some nights and sat with him in this same chair through the long, quiet hours. Their son, the boy, who had been allowed up to the shack from the age of 8, who had carried in armloads of kindling and watched the boil with his small, serious face. There had been more Larkin nights at this work than Albert could name. He let them be. They had been. They were. He thought, too, of the small habit of the work itself, which had passed through the 3 generations of his family as a kind of slow, careful inheritance. The way Augustus had set a tap, The way Caleb had banked a fire. The way Albert himself had learned, by watching both of them and then doing it himself for many years. To dip the dipper, to read the runoff, to know by the slow change in the way the boil sounded when the syrup was beginning to come down. There was a sound a boil made when the syrup was nearly ready. It was a small particular change in the seethe of the pans. The boil went from the open, hissing surface of a watery sap to a slower, thicker bubbling. The kind of bubbling a thickening syrup made as it neared the finish point. The bubbles were larger and slower. The sound was quieter and heavier. A man who had been listening for 41 springs heard the change without thinking about it. Albert was beginning to hear it now. The syrup pan in the last hour had gone into the slower, thicker note. He had been listening to it without listening. In the way of all long practiced things, he stood, slow, and went to the pan. He dipped the dipper. He let the runoff come off the dipper. He held the dipper up. The liquid came off in the slow, heavy sheet that finished syrup makes. The small, thin film at the dipper's edge, holding for an instant in the way the old men in Vermont call simply the sheet, and then breaking off in the slow, heavy drops that fall into the pan, one drop at a time. The liquid was amber. The liquid was thick. Albert held the dipper a moment longer and watched the small, slow drops. It was nearly done. He took the small hydrometer from its slot on the side of the evaporator. The hydrometer was a small, narrow glass float weighted at one end, calibrated for the proper density of finished maple syrup. He dipped a small ladle of the syrup pan liquid into the small testing cup. He floated the hydrometer. The line on the glass came up at perhaps a hair below the proper mark. A few more minutes. He fed the firebox one more split. Small, just to keep the heat. He stood at the pan. He waited. He watched the slow, heavy bubbles. He listened to the slow, heavy note of the boil. In 4 or 5 minutes, the boil had shifted again. The smallest shift. The bubbles slower yet. He dipped the hydrometer one more time. The line came up at the proper mark. The syrup was finished. Albert moved to the draw-off valve at the front of the syrup pan. He set the steel can underneath. The can was a 5-gallon can. with the small Larkin sugarbush stencil his father had had painted on the side in 1911. He opened the valve. The syrup came down in a slow, heavy amber stream. The smell of it at this moment was the moment for which a man kept a sugar bush. The smell of fresh finished syrup coming off the pan was not the smell of the boil anymore. It was a deeper, warmer, sweeter smell. The smell of maple sugar at its full self, of the long 40 gallons of sap that had given up their water to become this one heavy gallon of amber. The 40-to-1 ratio was the ratio every sugar maker on this continent had known since they had been making syrup. And it was the ratio that gave the syrup its particular weight, its particular sweetness. The long, thick run of it through the draw-off valve into the steel can. The can filled slow. Albert watched it. The first runoff from the pan was the lightest of the night's batch. What the trade called fancy in those years. The pale amber of an early season boil. He watched it come down with the small private pride of a man who had brought one more good batch out of a good sugar bush. The can took perhaps 2.5 gallons of it. He closed the valve. He set the lid on the can. He carried the can. Slow, with the small care a man takes with a heavy can of fresh syrup, to the small cool stand by the north wall, where the finished cans of the season had been accumulating. He set the can down beside the others. He looked at the row of cans. 12 cans now, this far in the season. A good run for a year. He came back to the chair. He fed the firebox one more time. He set the wood for the slow, long bank of the rest of the night. He banked the fire down, opening the small damper to slow the draft. The way a man banks a fire when the work is done, and only the keeping is left. The pans would simmer slow rather than boil hard. He took up the dipper. He hung it on its hook. He took up the skimmer. He hung it on its hook. He took down the heavy wool coat from the iron hook by the door. He put it on. He took up the cap. Edith had pulled the left flap down before he had left the house, and the flap had ridden up some hours ago. And Albert pulled it back down now in the small inward gesture of a man whose wife was particular about flaps. He took up the gloves. He went to the door. He looked one last time around the shack. The boil was banked. The steam off the cupola would slow now. The firebox would hold its small, slow bank of coals through the rest of the night. The pans would simmer. The work was set. He opened the door. He stepped out. He took up the lantern from the small flat stone where he had set it. He turned the wick back up. The flame stood up small and clean and yellow against the cold dark. He closed the door behind him. The latch fell. He stood for a moment on the small flat clearing in front of the shack and looked at the night. The sky had cleared full now. The stars were out. The half moon, which had been higher in the early evening, had moved down the west and was sitting now on the long dark line of the ridge across the valley. A pale white crescent, half set into the trees. The dipper was high in the north. The stars between were the wide, quiet stars of a clear, cold March pre-dawn. Very small. Very many. Very far. Albert could see them through the bare branches of the maples that stood around the shack. He looked at them for a long, quiet moment. He thought in the small, inward way he thought such things, that the sky over this hillside was the same sky Augustus had stood under on his sugaring nights in the 70s, and that Caleb had stood under in the 90s. And that he himself had been standing under for 41 springs. The stars had been the same stars. The world went on. The world had its long, quiet way. He walked down the path. The path was the path he had walked up some hours ago. And he walked it back now in the slow, easy tread of a man whose work was done, with the lantern at his hip and the small yellow circle of its light around him, and the wider blue-gray of starlit snow beyond. The snow had hardened in the deeper cold of the small hours, and the crunch underfoot was firmer now. The dry, sharp creak of a Vermont sugarbush at 2 o'clock in the morning. He walked down out of the upper stand of maple. He crossed the upper meadow. The meadow under the half moon and the stars was a long, pale slope of snow. He looked up once at the moon, sitting half set on the ridge, and he looked once at the bright, steady eye of Venus which had come round to the east now, very small, the morning star already at her morning watch. He went through the small gap in the stone wall. He went down through the lower stand of maple, past the small dark dots of the heeled tap holes on the trunks, past the slow, steady, silent trees, standing under their own light, dusting of late-season snow. He came to the gate of the lower pasture. He worked the latch. He stepped through. He pulled the gate shut behind him. He came up to the small back porch of the farmhouse. The kitchen window was dark. The whole house was dark. Edith had banked the kitchen stove low at her usual hour and gone up to bed, and the house had been sleeping for some hours. He blew out the lantern. He set it on the small shelf inside the porch. He opened the kitchen door. The warm, dry air of the kitchen came out to meet him. The small, slow heat of the banked kitchen stove was the only warmth in the room, and a small, low orange of coals showed through the slot in the stove door. But it was warm enough. He came in. He closed the door behind him. Soft. He took off the cap. He hung it on the hook. He took off the heavier coat. He hung it on the next hook. He took off the boots. He set them by the stove where they would dry. He stood for a moment in his socks on the kitchen floor. He listened. The house was very quiet. The clock on the kitchen wall, an old brass-cased 8-day with a slow, patient tick, was the only sound. Upstairs somewhere, the small, even breathing of Edith asleep. He went, slow in the way he went everywhere now. Through the small door from the kitchen to the parlor. Through the parlor. Through the small, narrow stair door. And up the stairs. The stairs creaked. Soft on the third step from the bottom where they had always creaked. Albert knew the creak. He stepped over it now in the small, unconscious way he had been stepping over it for 30 years. The bedroom was at the top of the stairs, on the right. The door was ajar. He pushed it gently open. The bedroom was warm with the small, slow heat of the banked bedroom stove, which Edith had set low before going to sleep. The small lamp on the bedside table was unlit. The window looking out over the lower pasture was a soft, pale rectangle of moonlit air. Edith was a small, soft shape under the wool blankets on her side, facing the wall, with her dark hair loose on the pillow. Albert undressed in the small, careful way he always undressed when he came in late from a boil. He took off the shirt and folded it across the chair. He took off the trousers and laid them across the shirt. He kept the union suit and the wool socks. He sat on the edge of the bed. The bed gave its small, familiar give under his weight. Edith did not stir. She had been the wife of a sugarmaker for 31 years, and she had slept through 10,000 small bed givings of her husband, coming in from boil. And she slept through this one too, in the small, soft, easy way she always did. He let his head rest in his hands for a small moment. He was tired. It was an honest tired. He liked it. He lay back. He pulled the wool blanket up. The blanket was the same blanket they had been sleeping under for years. A heavy brown wool blanket Edith had brought to the marriage in 1903. It smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where it lived in summer. He folded one arm behind his head. He let the other hand rest on his chest, where he could feel the slow rise and fall of his own breath under it. He closed his eyes. Down at the shack, far down the path he had walked, the small banked fire in the firebox was holding its slow, even heat. Through the small hours of the morning, the pans were simmering. The steam off the cupola was a thin, pale ribbon now. Only a small, visible breath. The Larkin sugarbush was at its quiet work, in the way it had been at its quiet work for 66 springs. He thought very small of all of it. His shoulders, which had been carrying the small, unconscious tensions of the long night, let them go. His hands let them go. His jaw let them go. His belly, beneath the warm wool of the blanket, settled. Edith shifted, small in the bed beside him. She did not wait. She reached in her sleep the small, unconscious reach of a wife who had been sleeping beside her husband for 31 years, and her warm hand settled against his arm under the blanket. He felt it. He did not move. He let it stay where it was. His thoughts slowed. They became no longer thoughts, but only the gentle drift of one thing into another. The walk up through the dark, the lantern at his hip, the pale column of steam rising from the cupola, the smell of the boil, the first warmth of the shack, the small wooden chair beside the firebox, the thermos cap in his hand, Augustus showing him the tap in 1892, the small dry praise of "that is well done," the slow heavy run of finished syrup into the steel can, the half moon on the ridge, the dipper, The crunch of the path under his boots in the cold of the small hours. Venus at her morning watch. The kitchen warm with the small low orange of the banked stove. The stairs. The bed. Edith's hand against his arm. He let it pass over him. He let it pass over him again. The owl on the ridge called once more, far off, and was quiet. The sugarbush kept itself in its long, slow, patient way. In the small hours of the night, the boil banked low at the shack went on, giving its small, steady simmer beneath the cooling pans. And the steam went up thin and pale through the cupola. He breathed. The farmhouse held him. The farmhouse had held him for 30 years now, and it knew how to hold him. His breath slowed. His shoulders softened. His hand on his chest rose and fell in the small, even rhythm of a man drifting down through the small, light layers of half-sleep into the deeper layers below. The clock in the kitchen, far down the stairs, gave its slow, patient tick. The wind in the maples outside the bedroom window was nothing tonight. The world held very still around the small, warm bedroom where Edith slept beside him, and where he himself was at last, lying down at the end of his night's work. Albert, who was tired and warm and old and not afraid, drifted gently down into the deep, easy quiet of sleep. The fire kept itself. The steam kept rising. The night kept being the night. And somewhere, in the dark above the sugarbush, the great wheel of the stars went on turning, as it had always turned, and would always turn. And Albert slept, and Edith slept beside him, and the world held them, and that was all. And now, a few quiet words to carry into sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The day is done. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. The room around you holds you gently. The bed beneath you holds you fully. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind may let go now. The long quiet is here. Sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet, sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet.